Thank you for joining us on this episode of MSP 1337, a podcast dedicated to helping MSPs and their clients navigate cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a journey, but it doesn't mean you have to travel alone. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and before we get started, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, PCmatic, endpoint security built on a zero trust, default deny philosophy, allowing only trusted sources and blocking all the rest. Lightweight, simple to deploy, easy to manage, and compatible with all major antivirus products. Find out about PCmatic's unique lead sharing program for MSPs, backed by a primetime national TV campaign. Together, we bring advanced security solutions combined with more than sales enablement. We bring actual leads. Find out more about PCmatic by visiting pcmatic.com/MSP. Now on with the show. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined this week by Charles Love of ShowTech Solutions. Welcome, Charles.
Thanks, Chris. Glad to be here.
Hey, so this week's topic is a little bit different, I think, than this trend we've had almost all month long that's been really focused on what I'll say is just people. People are fundamentally tied to all of the elements of security, and perhaps this one's no different, but the shift that we have today is that today I want to talk about vendors and vendors in the context of what are the responsibilities that our vendors have in providing us with services, ensuring that they're protecting the data that is we're going to put into their environment, those types of things. And lastly, we're doing this from the perspective of ShowTech Solutions is a managed service provider. And this is going to be part one of a two-part series. Part two is literally going to focus on someone who is a client that is in the trenches with an overall overarching environment that just assumes vendors always have their best interests. So we're going to start from the MSP perspective, and then next week will be obviously from the different angle. So Charles, we've had these conversations more than once. This isn't new. However, this topic came up literally yesterday for me. This is something that my superintendent for the school district that I'm at voiced, and he's like, Chris, you should talk about this on your podcast. And I was like, I think you're right. I think this has a lot of magnitude to it as we think about who are the pieces involved in ensuring whether you are the client or you're working with a client to ensure security. So Charles, I want to sort of tee it off for you. The question specifically is, when you look at working with a vendor, what are the steps that you go through that say yes or no? And I understand that people talk about the checklist, and I think it's more than a checklist. I think this is to some degree, it's like dating, right? You just because they are certain height, meet certain criteria, and I don't want to go off in the weeds here, but some of that's true. Like with a vendor, like if I go to your website and the website is confusing, doesn't look like it's been built in the last, say, 5 years, I'll give you some latitude there, last 5 years, you might just completely move on, right? So start there. Walk me through your process, and I'll ask questions along the way, and then we'll see if this doesn't give some overall guidance to those that will be listening to this episode.
Yeah, no problem. So when it comes to looking up vendors, right? We talked about the checklist, right?
Right.
There is a checklist, and everyone's checklist is a little bit different, right? So some people have learned things and have been burned or got surprised, things like that. So I can kind of walk you through what I check for.
Yeah.
You have to remember in the mode of an MSP, typically we're going to take on that relationship with the vendor.
Good.
Right? We're going to pay the bill, not the end customer. So we ultimately we are the customer, and there are some things I always need to kind of know, and they're not pass fail, but I just need to know.
Okay.
So top of that list, do they have a direct sales team?
Or do they sell direct to your potential client?
Correct. So if I'm going to load in my customer data, is that vendor then going to then sell around me to go to that vendor? This isn't necessarily a pass-fail question, but it's one I take very serious.
It's a need-to-know answer.
Yeah, absolutely, because it kind of dictates how I enter their data into the system.
Right.
just because they have a direct team doesn't mean we're not going to do business with them. I just need to know so I can prep the customer. Hey, if you ever get a call from XYZ, just let them know you're working with us.
Right.
Right. That kind of thing. But that's a good one to know, because if they do, maybe we can work with them. Maybe it can be a two-way street. So the sales team is a biggie. When we start talking about more of the what I like to call the geeky techie stuff,
Mm-hmm.
I want to see a status page, right? Do they have a public status page? And if I go to that status page and I look at the last 90 days,
Mm-hmm.
is it 100%? Right?
And again, not deal breaker, but to some extent, just having a status page adds a layer of transparency that many vendors still haven't adopted.
Correct.
Or
But
the idea of.
But in 90 days, if I see 100%, it's a lie. There's not a single vendor out there that can offer that. There's some kind of maintenance. That means you're not doing maintenance, right? You're not rebooting things. What's going on?
Well, let's pause just for a second right there. I think probably since Atlassian really came onto the scene with their status product, it was kind of Pandora's box, right? Like vendors that had it, how to find it, if it was of any meaningful value. I kid you not, I think in probably the last 6 months, any vendor that I've worked with that I just typed the word status dot domain name,
Yep.
90% of the time I've gotten rewarded with what I was looking for.
And it saves so much time, right?
Yeah.
So in
No
365 land, yeah. So for 365, if a customer is saying, hey, something's weird with Teams, that is the first place I'm looking at.
Right.
They're pretty good about updating it. Some of the other vendors are pretty good about updating it, but it's the ones that have a status page that show no outages whatsoever, ever. Like uplink providers have issues, right? There's maintenance windows. There's things happen out of control. There's never 100% guarantee.
Well, is that kind of a checklist item? Like when I think about a vendor or a product, depending
For
on the
sure.
client, it's like, what's your maintenance schedule look like? How often is it? What's your product cycle look like?
Yeah, all good points. And how do you report that data?
Right.
Right. So how do you tell me that something is happening? Because I need to know so I can prep those customers. So right after status, this one is kind of near and dear to my heart, but who owns the data? Right? So who owns whatever the thing is? So I'll just use 365 as a good example, just because it's top of mind. If I move somebody to 365, well, the customer owns the data. It's their email.
Sure.
Right? And if for whatever reason we're no longer going to be doing business with them, it's there. Somebody else can take over that.
Sure.
that thing. But man, we come across a lot of customers where we're taking them over. I had one 2 weeks ago, and the guy has like some wacky web hosting, and under his account, he's creating sub accounts for customers. So, and they can't, like, the customer's not an admin. It's not their data. It's this guy's data. He's taking on all the compliance concerns and all the drama for this customer. And if they ever want to leave or ripcord out for whatever reason, they can't, because this is in this specific case, it's like this guy's personal stuff. It's under that company.
Is this the age-old model? I mean, you go back in time a little bit, what was considered acceptable when we think about the white label model? Like even the old Bez server environment, people were hosting Exchange and branding it whatever, right? Like you remember some of those vendors, like
For sure.
like. But today we have compliance, regulatory laws, all these other things that says,
Yes.
why would you want to be the full burden of responsibility for something that might be under the hood, something that's got big resources and can do heavy lifting, and your client's like, oh, Microsoft, yeah, we've heard of them.
Yeah. It's just so many people are doing that, and it traps the customer. Stickiness I get. All right, stickiness I get. But for whatever reason, the customer gets a new ownership, something happens. If that relationship has to change, when you're keeping it in your own little bubble, you can't move it, right? So you're forcing the hand of the customer that, all right, you have to find a new solution, and the last 3 years of archive, yeah, that all goes away,
Right.
right? And there's a whole new compliance nightmare happening because you can't provide the last 3 years of archive, right? In that example.
It's the so this is something, so I'm trying to go through the CISP certification, and when I say try, it's a lot of content to consume. I've made it about 3/4 of the way through twice. This is my third attempt. Bandwidth is a problem for me. But the premise of CISP and a lot of the, I would just say any framework, is the triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility. And I think one of the things that we get ourselves into a hot seat on is, can we ensure accessibility when we're gone?
Yep.
Because we always need to have that mindset, right? We need to have the mindset that's one of these days I could be gone. And it may not be the company. You may think smaller than that and go, what if I personally am gone? What do I hold the keys to?
For sure.
If this was in our personal life, if I died tomorrow, would my wife be able to get into the bank accounts? And the list goes on and on and on. The accessibility thing becomes paramount over security. And yet, fundamentally, if something is inaccessible, would you consider it to be secure?
Mm-hmm.
Probably not, right? Like, it's like, well, I couldn't get to it today. The status page says they're in a maintenance window again. So, all right, we've got 3 items on your checklist right now.
Yeah, and so the big reason for that is, if I decide I want to change that vendor out, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to do a bit of vendor Olympics, so to speak. How do I get that? How do I transpose that data? Now, if it's an antivirus product, I don't care, right?
And does that necessarily mean who owns the data versus how easy is it to make my data portable? Like,
I guess it depends on the data, right?
because I own it and I can use it for advertising and marketing and or I'm going to hold it hostage. Those get into that who owns my data. But if it's because my system was built in such a way that extracting it, they're like, oh, well, here's your CSV file. And you're like, oh, crap.
Well, I'll give you just a good example. So a customer has an accounting package. They've been using it for years and years and years and years. They acquired a new firm who has a very similar accounting package. So it had been, I think, 4 months on trying to get them to export the proper tables out.
Oh, geez.
Right. And it's, tax time.
Right.
So it's kind of a nightmare. And the customer had no idea that what they were doing was like this vendor had never done before. They had never tried to give away data. And it was very clear because every step of the way it was a nightmare. So in that end, if I want to shift, how hard is it to get the data that's required? If there's data. Right. So a SaaS protection product, I can probably download the PSTs. Right. Security products, I probably don't care. They're rip and replace, no big deal. But if it's stuff like a sync and share thing, some kind of solution that maintains data, how do I port it out?
Sure.
Or how do I port it in if I want to go? Right. So, it's a question I like to ask. And then the immediate follow-up to that is, I don't need to know the exact specifics, but where is that data housed? Right. There's a bad stigma over Azure and, Google data centers and all this stuff, but I don't care what vendor they pick.
Sure.
It doesn't matter to me. I just want to know if it's in the US, right? Because there are some customers where I have to maintain that, and I have to be able to answer the question, hey, Charles, where's their data housed? And if I say, I don't know, that's terrible.
Right. Or I believe it's in this location, but I can't be definitive. I think that's probably one of the bigger problems we're faced with that is often overlooked, not because we don't care, but because, like I said before we got on this episode, is that we assume, right? If my vendor is headquartered in the United States, I would quickly assume, or you would think one could assume, that therefore my data lives here as well. And it's funny because I talk to Canadian MSPs and they have no such preconceived notion. right? So they talk to vendors all the time, and they also assume that data is potentially stored in the United States, and they're in Canada. So that poses all kinds of problems if your company is headquartered in Canada and your clients are like, wait a second, you're storing my data in a US data center? Like, we should probably talk about this. We don't have the conversation in the US because our clients also assume that our data has stayed here in the US.
For
So
sure.
I think that's a really good point that probably needs more attention than what's being given today, is that have a conversation with your client. Where can your data live? Because they may not know the regulations or compliance drivers around their particular industry necessarily. We've seen that over and over again. But if you ask them, are you okay with your data living outside of the United States? I'd say by and large, most of them would say absolutely not.
For sure. For sure. So right after who owns my data.
Sure.
Um,
And then
the, the,
where's
the
my data?
yeah, and then where's my data? The next thing I want to know is how do I make changes? Right, that one's important. So I have one vendor where I have to buy licenses. Every time I have to buy licenses, I get a DocuSign. I have
Sure.
to wait for the guy's boss to send me a DocuSign if he remembers. I then get the DocuSign. Immediately I sign it, send it back, and I have to spend the next 10 days. Hey, can you add those licenses? Can you add those licenses?
Sure.
So for an MSP, I need to know how are licenses added and removed? Is it the goofy, really, I want to add one license, I have to go through 30 minutes of paperwork? Or can I just hit the up button and go, tink, 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 I have more licenses, or remove it, right? Like have more of a, so is the relationship a master agreement that I can dial up or dial down?
Sure.
Or do I really have to contract each and every change?
So then let's take that in a different direction. So we'll think about like data center organizations that take security really seriously. I won't say names because there's a lot of them. They're very similar. Um, I need to make a change to a domain controller, or sorry, to the firewall in my data center environment that is managed by the data center. So that involves a change request too. I've got to open a ticket. I've got to ask, I've got to articulate the rules. I often have to schedule time with an administrator on their end to make those changes. So it seems like there's almost like we're going down a set of questions that almost run in parallel. One set of questions is all about the financial impacts or the business impacts that you have when working with a vendor. And then there's a completely different set of questions that may intertwine. So like talking about seats, just because I can, once it's been signed, all that's done, but now getting the seat in for to use it is more technical, right? Like it's there. Why can't I use it yet? Versus I've signed off and I've paid for it and I got all the green lights on that. I kind of am sensing like a parallel set of questions. One could be easily asked by you, the business owner, and the other set of questions could be like your director of technical operations is like, well, I need to know these things. And oh, by the way, does this integrate with Autotask or ConnectWise or TigerPaw or whatever my PSA is? Is it something that should be separated out, or do you just kind of make a note that these kind of fall into some different categories as far as questions?
It definitely different categories, but it's important to know, right, how you before you enter in that relationship, how they handle changes, right? I'm a huge fan of consumption billing, right?
Sure.
I'm totally cool
Spin it
having a
up, spin it
minimum.
down.
Yeah, like I'll have a minimum, whatever that minimum may be. But man, if I want to on a Monday jam it up 100 and jam it down on a Tuesday, I want that flexibility
Sure.
without having to sign paperwork, because it's
Every
just a waste
time.
of my time and
Yeah.
then the reps' time and then their manager's time and accounting. Oh my lord,
Yeah.
just bill
The
me at the end of the
quoting.
month.
Yeah. I was gonna say quoting to quote is quite painful. So we've got, I don't know, 5 or 6 sort of key checklist items. Let's shift gears a little bit because obviously the show is very much about cybersecurity. Talk to me about that sort of posture. I mean, we talked about it. Status page was a good starting point, right? Like I feel like when a vendor discloses status of product, maintenance cycles, those types of things, that gives me a good warm fuzzy, at least in the initial starting this conversation, that they're serious about keeping me informed about their products, their infrastructure, their availability, all that. Talk me through questions that you might ask a vendor when we start talking about security. Like maybe it's from the perspective of account level access versus do they have access to the accounts? Are things, kept at bay? And walk me through some of those.
So an odd question I don't think I've ever would have dreamed I would ask a vendor that I've been asking lately is, so on your support team and on your business side, what do you map to? Right? What controls? Like I don't need to see them, but do you even attempt to follow NIST? Do you look at CIS? Whatever. Like, what do you
Sure.
guys try to frame the team around?
Like, how do you standardize so that if you did share with me, I would understand that you are mapping to something that I recognize?
For sure, because the answer you don't want to hear is we don't do any of that.
Right.
Right.
We came up with our own control set. It's called
Yeah.
no control set.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to know kind of how they follow it. And when it comes into what I like to call proxy access, how deep can they go? Right. So a lot of vendors, there's that encryption key where they can kind of see the account, but unless I do a thing to give them access, they can't just go willy-nilly pop in my account and fiddle with stuff.
It's
Like
kind of
there's
like
a
providing them a key. Like if I don't give you a key, which does expire, you can't get in.
100%. It's like a support token, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like the vendors who say, "Hey, if you lose this key, we will more than help you set up a brand new account because you ain't getting it back."
Right. Like
Right?
the data is gone. So don't lose this
Yeah.
key.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, that's definitely a good question to ask. Do you have willy-nilly access into our stuff, or do you have like a support token mechanism where I have to approve you, things like that?
Right. So and obviously as an MSP, can my clients call you for support?
Correct. And hopefully the answer is no. Right. Not to, uh, uh, you know, make the customer feel anxious or anything like that, but like in the case of Datto, right? I've gone through training. I've sat for hours and hours listening to speeches on Linux,
Yeah.
and I know what I'm doing. I know if I hit this one button, I'm going to get a bill for a round trip drive,
Right.
right? If I just give a customer willy nilly access to the Datto portal and they're like, oh, I'm just going to delete the backup every day and put a new one in,
Yes.
they have the ability, unbeknownst to them, to mess with the bill,
Right.
right? To start
Right.
adding charges, things like that. So, and they're not certified. They didn't go through the training.
Right.
They don't do the quarterly updates like we do. So, there are some scenarios where, yeah, if they call the vendor, you know, like it's one thing the vendor can go, hey, so and so customer's calling, you may want to check with them. Oh, okay, no big deal.
Right.
And away we go. Um, but that's something to know, right? Because the customer may not have admin access to that thing.
Well, I think this is for me almost a segue into you mentioned this. You like to control or own the relationships with the vendors as opposed to your client owning those relationships. But we all know you come into a client environment that has relationships with the vendors, whether it's their QuickBooks or Salesforce or any number of, especially when you get into cloud-based apps, right? There's a relationship that pre-exists in many cases
Yep.
when we come in. What does your evaluation process look like? Do you like, I mean, I can understand just saying, those are your vendors and we're going to stay out of it. Or there's these are your vendors, but we have the following expectations if we're going to support you with those vendors. Like, what does that look like?
So it depends on the vendor, right?
Of course.
So QuickBooks, for example, I don't want to get in the mix of that.
Sure.
That's its own nightmare. However, what I do need to know is if we need their assistance, what is involved, right? So local in here in Tampa Bay, the internet companies now have something called the support pin. So as long as I have the phone number, the zip code, and the support pin, those three things, I can call on behalf of a customer.
Well, you said the internet, so it's like the letter of authorization.
Kind of, yeah.
Or
They
similar.
just it's the same idea. But if I have those three things, the account pin is like listed on the bill,
Sure.
or the portal.
Right.
But I can call up Frontier on behalf of XYZ Church,
Sure.
and I can talk to them, and I'm validated.
Right.
If I just called QuickBooks, like, hey, this is Charles from ABC, accounting, and I'd like some help, they have no way to identify who I am. And
I'm wanting
chances
to
are,
export the database to my local machine.
Yeah, exactly. So,
well, okay, so let me ask you a question then along those lines. So I'm actually working with someone right now where their apps are obviously not managed by me, whether it's an IT company or otherwise, or not, they're managed in-house. So like we're talking Salesforce, Google Enterprise. I'll say there's at least 6 to 10 apps that are in there. Even one of them is even LastPass. One of the things that I got tasked with was just helping them think through security with those vendor apps. And so one of the things I said is two-factor authentication turned on with all your vendors? They're like, what does that mean? So like, if I think about what your role is as an MSP, and if I'm your client and I've got 20, 30 apps that we're responsible for maintaining a data integrity with, because it's what we use to operate, the apps that you don't manage, obviously you don't know, but is there some sort of like need to have a sit down that says you have these 6 other apps, QuickBooks, whatever it is. Let's walk through how you access those things. Because what happens if one of those apps is the breach that gets the threat actor into their environment, they're inside now, and potentially puts them in a position to get access into your environment?
Man, that is the topic of the year, right? Especially with a lot of the working from home stuff, right?
Right.
It's
geolocation on what was one office. We're like, yeah, you can only get to QuickBooks from this IP address. And now it's like, there are 30 of us that have 30 IP addresses, and half of them or 2/3 of them or all of them change every 72 hours.
Yeah. And we ran into a situation where somebody had been working for a customer for 19 years. And she unknowingly, we'll see, saved everything to Google, right? Saved everything to save into my browser, right? Google makes it easy. Hey, do you want to save this? Sure, right? And then that customer leaves, and we get a scathing text. Stop trying to hack my account. I'm going to get the sheriff involved, all this stuff. But unbeknownst to the customer, all of the accounts had been accidentally set up with that lady's Gmail account. So,
Jeez.
so not only are the passwords trapped in her personal Google account, they're tied to her Google account too.
So every time she logs in on another device and turns on sync, she's just added another location that those sit.
Well, and it's a good conversation to have, because the customer's like, well, why didn't you export her personal passwords? I'm like, listen to what you just said, right? Because they're in there. You told me to get rid of the user. I got rid of the user. Now we lost access to all this stuff, right? Remember that password, manager I was trying to tell you about a couple years ago? Yeah, that was so expensive. Well, look where we are now, right? So, but
I'll have my attorney call your attorney, and it'll cost roughly way more than it would have been for any password manager.
Yeah, and it's who owns the account, right? Who owns the data? And then two-factor is so huge. I think we mentioned it on a previous podcast where
I think we've mentioned it on most of the episodes.
Yeah. Well, but everyone goes to like a password manager and they don't turn on two-factor. It's like, cool, you just made it super easy for anybody to just, because I'm sure you use the same password for LastPass.
That's I'm gonna go skydiving, and I'm pretty sure my parachute works because the company that issues the parachutes, they've had a really great success track record. And so since I'm using their parachute on this plane, oh wait, I forgot about the pilot.
For sure. Yeah. And Two-factor really needs to be a part of this conversation, right? Can my users use two-factor, and can I get a report if they're not? Right. So a lot of the softwares now, you say, mandatory two-factor, and if somebody hasn't set it up, there's a little icon like a key with a no sign on it or something like that. That's a real. I mean, you're going to get the two-factor haters. I get it. Or if it does texting or something, it's not as good, but it's better than nothing.
So Charles, I feel like we went through, I'm going to say a relatively comprehensive checklist, but at the same time, it almost barely scratches the surface of what I would say is part of that vendor evaluation. So I'm throwing this back at you again, not because I'm asking you to come up with, dude, you got to fill in the blanks. You only gave me 10.
Yeah.
But more along the lines of what would you tell other MSPs or even their clients is like, what's the mindset that you really need to have when you start evaluating a vendor? Because I think that the mindset is almost more important than the checklist.
For sure. And the one thing I do, and I'm a nerd about it, is I have a things to ask potential vendors IT glue document. Right?
Okay.
And I go to it, and I recently added the two-factor icon. Step 14 or whatever literally says, ask vendor if somebody doesn't have two-factor if there's an indication.
So, and that is, as many of you know who listen to this show, that I am by day a tech director for a school district, and we're working with a vendor that through the process of tightening the security on things like Google Enterprise and some other services, I uncovered what I felt was a poorly configured mail situation. Upon further investigation, the vendor's like, yeah, that's kind of on you. And what concerns me isn't who's responsible for doing it. It's that I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a vendor has an obligation and a responsibility to educate the client on what is best practices from a security standpoint and highlight the areas of compliance that we are all bound by when we start talking about personal identifiable information and financial information.
As is the world we're in, right?
Which goes back to mindset with a vendor, right? So if I sit down with a vendor and I have a mindset that is, let's thinking through like, okay, this vendor solves problem X in my organization, or it's an efficiency or productivity improvement that we never in a million years thought about, but here it is in front of us. Does it make sense for us to adopt this, right? My Google spreadsheet was working great for tickets. And then I stumbled upon a PSA that just blew my mind, right? Like it wasn't that I needed it necessarily, depending on whether or not my organization was to a point where it was more than just me. But like those things happen, right? And so are we in a mindset when we evaluate that we don't pull a Chris, right? Right. I'm notorious for the shiny object syndrome. Man, their website was so cool. What problem do they solve? I don't know, but it's cool, right? And then 2 years later, we're implementing the product to identify like, dude, why didn't we implement this 2 years ago? Well, because Chris didn't really know anything about it. It was cool, shiny object, and we bought it. Now we're using it. We're glad we are. But again, if your mindset is not in the right place when you're evaluating a vendor, you're going to make a decision that goes one of two ways. I bought it because it was cool. It solves a problem I didn't know I have, those types of things. Or you get a product that you desperately need, but you fail to implement it correctly because you're so urgent on adopting a product to solve a problem that you don't do the due diligence that's required that we just spent the last 30 minutes talking about coming up with a checklist.
Sure. And Vendor Olympics, like that needs to be a absolute last resort.
So Vendor Olympics, what's that, Charles? Correct.
Sorry.
Tell me Vendor Olympics, because maybe we're going to have an episode called Vendor Olympics.
Yeah. So Vendor Olympics is when you get annoyed by a thing. There was an outage one time. Sure. Something isn't the way you want. I'm going to rip out all my things and I'm going to go to something else.
Okay.
And then
I thought that's where you were going with it. So I'm glad I didn't say it, but that's awesome. So Vendor Olympics it's not only should it be a last resort, it should never happen. There's no
Yeah,
reason to play vendor Olympics, because it goes right back to the 2 points I just made, which is you're making the decision because someone's got more features. Someone always has more features, right? I mean, shoot, 10 years ago, we were happy that one PSA updated and gave us a new feature, but we were not going to jump to another PSA because it had 8 features that we didn't have in the one we were in, because we all knew what the lift was going to be.
for sure. It really needs to be a very thought out. Like, all right, even if you've come to determination, you know what, I'm gonna swap vendors for a various reason. It it's kind of like when you acquire a company. Don't touch it for 3 to 6 months. Just kind of let it
Yeah.
roll.
Yeah. It was working before you bought it. Don't break it, right?
Yeah. Just kind of observe,
Right.
see what's what. I mean, if there's a reason to make the change, make the
Sure.
change.
Understood.
But there's always unforeseen things. Training on the team, documenting the updates on all the customers. There's a lot of behind the scenes.
We're not going down the rabbit hole of spending time on the
No,
exceptions,
no,
right?
no,
Like that would be
for sure.
that'd be a series that we don't have time for. So as we wrap this up, Charles, where can people find you?
So Twitter, Charles J Love, and on LinkedIn, Charles Love on there. So
Got it. So as we look at next week's episode, we're going to take sort of the conversation that started here, and we're going to pick up where sort of we left off. And that is really digging into what is the client perspective. And this is really being focused on the K-12 space, because I think that a lot of what's in the K-12 space today doesn't have some of the perspective that comes from outside of education, because we started in education and stayed in education. So I'll be interviewing next week John Munford of New London School District to talk about what are vendor requirements that we should all have. And while we are talking about this in the K-12 space, I'm not saying this to say because it's K-12 only relevant to K-12. No, I want to get perspective from somebody who's dealing with the K-12 space, because I think the rest of us that are in different verticals, different industries can relate to it. And it might quite honestly be almost the same. So with that, I appreciate everybody that's been listening. This has been MSP 1337. Have a great week, everybody.